Welcome to the Future of Structures podcast, where we talk to the experts who are evolving our buildings for tomorrow. And here is your host, Adam Jones.
Today we are speaking with Princess Ventura. She is a director at Urbis. Urbis do a lot of interesting projects, so urban planning, design, policy, heritage, valuations, transactions, economics or research. And her background is actually as an economist for the World Bank. So she has a really unique mix of skills that she's bringing into the property market. So in the interview, we talk about some of the trends she's seeing in property, what makes a good mixed-use development, so things like getting the mix right, catering for everyone, establishing a clear vision, and so on. And also how money flows into the property and the trend of the gap between the haves and the have-nots in our cities. So it makes for a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot from Princess. I hope you guys enjoy it as well. And without any further ado, here is Princess Ventura.
So in terms of background, I have a bachelor's in economics from Eastern Connecticut State University in the US, and I have an MBA from Monash Business School. So my training is as an economist, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to practice in that field for over 20 years now. In terms of where I've been, career background, I really don't change that much. I've been at Urbis for 9 years now. I'm a partner of the company, and I lead the property economics and research practice here in Sydney. I have a team of about 17 people while we're a national business. Before that, I actually had a very different career path. I was an economist for the World Bank as part of the South Asia region, focused on poverty reduction and economic management.
So when you're at the World Bank, what was that like, and how does, I guess, the skills you learned there relate to the property market?
Yeah. What was that like? The focus is still economics. I've always been in economics. The focus is just that at that time it was more on public policy. What are sort of the public policy that developing countries need to take in order to promote faster economic growth, and also how to make that growth much more equitable. How do we address issues of poverty? So a bit different. Yeah. So the way that I link it is, I guess, that's about growth and poverty reduction, whereas what I do at Urbis relates more to the growth part of the equation. Another part of the business at Urbis deals with the whole, equity and poverty reduction, those sort of outcomes for society, which is our economic and social advisory.
Yep. And
so I guess that's what's different. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask, so in what ways can you, I guess, reduce poverty? And in the developing countries, what did that look like, and what does it look like if you're looking at the city level?
Yeah, so I think it's the similarity is the theme of access. So issues of poverty really always relate to access, whether it be access to markets, access to information, access to a high quality education, access via transport and infrastructure. So most of the issues that relate to poverty relate to these things, where there is an uneven access. People have uneven access to all these different aspects of infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I mean, both social, the softer side, and harder stuff like the economic and transport infrastructure. When you look at that from a city perspective, it's pretty similar in that we know that those who can afford to are the ones who live either in the center of the city or in the inner city. Those who have always had good access from the very beginning to high quality education that then translates to access to fantastic economic opportunities, to higher earning potential, that then affords them the ability to be able to live in the inner parts of our city and have access to not just economic opportunities, but to amenities as well. And those who have not had such a privileged start who might not have had such a high quality of education, then, that kind of becomes a cycle then, but then they do not have access to the same sort of economic opportunities. And when it comes to where you live within the city, that less fortunate part of society, I guess, is pushed out into our edges, the edges of the city, where access to jobs and amenities is not quite as strong as in the inner city.
So at the high level, do you think, I guess, what's the trend with access? Are people who are not so fortunate getting more access due to things like the internet and all of that? Or is the gap between people with access to education and some of these kind of things, is that discrepancy growing, or is it shortening so we're all of equal opportunity?
I think in the Sydney context, the housing affordability issue puts us at risk in terms of widening that gap. And particularly when we're slower. State government is slower to allow for renewal of areas within the inner city, such as the base precinct, for instance. And politically, it's less palatable to redevelop or increase the density in areas of the city that have very strong access to amenities and to employment. And the easy solution is to just keep sprawling. So, we have these growth areas now where if we sprawl, the challenge then is the question of, can we actually afford to deliver high quality social and economic infrastructure at these edges, including, public transport, schools, open space, and would businesses actually follow where the sprawl of the city is going to? Or are people going to be forced to travel long distances to get to their jobs, which has an impact on the quality of their living? So is it getting better? I think it's hard to see how that's getting better. When I think about, for example, but there are opportunities to make that better. When I think, for instance, of cities such as Hong Kong and Singapore, where they actually mandate that affordable housing, social housing, and key worker housing be delivered in transport-oriented development, in overstation developments. So that sort of policy is something that we're not really pursuing as a country or even as a city. But something like that, for instance, would improve the distribution or, the access to amenities, opportunities, and services of people.
Yeah. I guess I wasn't planning on getting into, too much into the property market in general, but it's quite an interesting topic. Do you think, the growth in the construction in Australia do you expect that to continue and keep on growing, or do you think it's going to slow down and then naturally, due to supply and demand, that housing and the housing affordability might come down a little bit and be a bit easier to get into?
Yeah. I think the strong growth in construction is going to continue, at least in the short and medium term. I mean, I can't see that leveling off because we're fortunate enough that we enjoy very strong population growth. So a lot of people still want to move to Australia. A lot of skilled migrants still want to move to Australia. And that's really what's also driving the construction sector, in addition to housing formation, for instance.
Yeah, nice. So, how are our cities changing at with the kind of trends that are coming through at the moment? How are our cities changing?
Our cities are changing. You mean in Australia, or more broader than that?
Just in the broad sense at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we know that our cities are growing. They're densifying, given that 80% of people now live in cities, and that's unlikely to decline. If at all, that's probably going to intensify even further. They're becoming more diversified in terms of the kind of people and the origin of people who visit them, who live in them, the kind of businesses that are located in our cities. Our cities are also changing in that they're renewing themselves, they're recreating themselves, because I think there are more cities now than, say, even in the past 10 years, which means that cities really have to reinvent themselves to remain competitive in a global context.
Mm. So what does that look like if a city wants to recreate itself? Because I'm looking out right now in Melbourne, and there's just all these buildings that are already there. How can a city recreate themselves if it's so much just, I guess, developed land?
Yeah, well, you see that in Sydney. Buildings are getting knocked down and redone again, or areas that were not part of the city are now being part of the city. So if you think about Sydney, the central business district, Barangaroo didn't exist. It's hard to imagine that Barangaroo did not even exist 2 years ago. That's part of urban renewal, where the city has pushed that way. The whole circular key precinct in Sydney is also being redone. So Key Quarter, which is a really, really old area of the CBD that's owned by AMP, for instance, those buildings are actually being torn down and rebuilt again to be more fit for the future, and also to have a better sense of place. Most of the changes that you see actually in the Sydney CBD, interestingly enough, are not to make places look even more modern or shiny. They're actually to bring in more that place perspective into them, and more activity and vibrancy on the street level.
Yeah, cool. So what are some of the other things that I guess make a really good development? And if we just look at maybe mixed-use developments, I saw you wrote an article on this. What are some of the factors that make up a good development?
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors. So that article, that Urbis article, has sort of 10 success drivers for mixed-use developments. But I think all of those could be grouped under, authenticity. I think a fantastic place is really authentic. It has local relevance. It's not just some design that existed from somewhere else and is transplanted into a city. It really is a reflection of the history, the culture, and the values of people who live in that city. It's inclusive. It's not just for the well-heeled visitor or resident or worker. That it is a kind of place where people from different demographic backgrounds, ages, feel comfortable in a space, in a place. And then I think thirdly, that the place is flexible. Flexible in that it can change and recreate itself to meet needs of the future. It has enough of that flexibility. But also it's dynamic, that it's not static and doesn't necessarily look the same or feel the same every single day of the year, that it might reflect certain important milestones or cultural significant dates, or reflect seasons, for instance. I think those are different aspects of what would make a place or mixed-use development special.
So at the moment, do these, I guess, all these things that make a mixed-use development special, do they make, putting the developer's hat on for a second, do they make economic sense at the moment? Because sometimes we see, I guess, a building go up and it's very shoebox apartments kind of thing. So at the moment, what is more profitable, and is there any ways you can make, I guess, the more ideal solution for, I guess, the city more profitable in itself?
I think it depends on what kind of development you're looking at and how competitive a particular property sector is. When you talk about residential in the Sydney market, we still are underdone in terms of supply. There's far more demand than there is supply in the market. We can't quite build fast enough yet. Yeah. So that is what's driving the fact that, a lot of the apartments in Sydney tend to not feel that special, that they're, simple boxes. It feels like they're just simple boxes that are built, and then that's enough to be profitable. I think what really drives innovation and investment in places is competition. And when a certain aspect, such as placemaking, is important to the final customer. So in the commercial space, for instance, and in the retail space, that's becoming very competitive now. And in terms of the newer generation of workers as well, what research has found is that, the things to do around the office building that they work in, the sense of place of where that office building is beyond just where they sit day to day, is becoming very important to workers. So therefore, that's becoming really important to companies when they look for office space. And it's, in a sense, that's really what's driving this investment in placemaking. I guess is one side of the equation. I mean, that's why you see Barangaroo, like in terms of the ground plane, in terms of the street level, how much investment they put into placemaking, to making sure that, they're not just takeaway food or food courts, that they actually do feel special. You see that's one side of the equation. The second side of the equation is that we're actually finding now that retailers who are located in locations that have a very strong sense of place. I'll give you one example. The other one is Dexus has a gateway development here in Circular Quay. They redid that, and they did make an investment in the outdoor area. Yep. And, making sure that has a sense of place. That's actually translated to higher sales, higher turnover for the retailers, because it has brought in more customers than it ordinarily would if they didn't make that investment in placemaking. And that's translating to higher rents for the property owners. So I think there's a change now in terms of what people expect from a retail property or a commercial property. And because customers' expectations of what these assets are supposed to look like are changing, then property owners and developers are now starting to respond to that. Whereas if you look back, probably not even as far back as maybe just 5 years ago, I'd say, there wasn't a return because there wasn't that expectation of this sense of place for commercial and retail assets in particular.
Yeah, it definitely makes a big difference. I know personally, working in an office that looks like a prison cell has a big difference in productivity compared to a really cool office with a lot of amenities and all that kind of stuff. And there's also the well rating tool, which is starting to get traction in Australia, which focuses on some of those placemaking aspects that you were mentioning. Yeah, and like that's exactly why some companies such as Google do make a big investment in terms of the amenities in their properties. It's also because people, if they're happy in their environment, they're more likely to stay back late because they are enjoying that space. They're not in such a hurry to leave work. And they've also studies have found a relationship between that and the level of engagement that people have. Do you have an opinion also on, I guess, what this might placemaking at the city scale as well compared to the development scale? Because I could imagine if a whole city tries to take in the idea of placemaking, it'll have a big effect on the whole community's well-being as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. And I think we're coming to see that, at least at a precinct level. So you see precincts, you see a lot of cooperation now between government and the different developers that are involved in a particular precinct as opposed to competing. You see that, for instance, in the Central Park, Kensington Road precinct here in Sydney, where there are actually different developers responsible for delivering different aspects of that precinct. But everyone has worked together to ensure that, there's a consistent delivery of the outdoor space and the ground floor amenity. Absolutely. I mean, you see that as well. We're seeing that as well in Circular Quay now, where City of Sydney is actually forcing owners and developers in that area who have development applications in place to demonstrate how that's going to impact on the broader precinct.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal change. I guess as we're wrapping it up now, what do you think will have the biggest impact on the buildings industry going forward in the future?
That's a hard one. There are probably a couple of things. It's really, really hard to answer this question without getting into the technology space. And
please go into technology.
Yeah. And I'm not that kind of person. That's why I'm kind of I don't like that question because I'm sort of not in that kind of area. But I'd say it's probably, I think, changes in terms of transport, in terms of how we're going to travel in the future is a question. So the whole question on autonomous vehicles, does that mean we need less car parking? What happens to all this car parking that we've invested in? What about, why I say transport is because what does that mean if we have autonomous vehicles and you can actually, your time in traveling potentially is not dead time anymore. You can be doing work or doing other things, leisure, while you're in your car and it's driving you home. What does that mean? Will that mean that it would push us out to sprawl even more than in the past? So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect I think that will change is why I was saying technology is in the industrial sector, the industrial and logistics, for example. The increasing use of robotics would mean a change and an investment in our logistics and industrial assets, because those dark warehouses and the distribution and warehousing centers that use robotics have a much higher clearance rates than what our sheds are currently built as. So I think technology is going to be big. I mean, technology, there are questions as well on what our mixed-use developments, could that change what our mixed-use developments would look like? If we had robots in terms of human beings, if we had more environmentally sustainable way of manufacturing things that are not so noisy and smelly, does that mean then even industrial uses can be integrated into mixed use?
Love it. Yeah, that's a phenomenal answer to the question. Even a technologist would be very happy with the answers you can. And just quickly, just one last one. You mentioned sustainability there. Do you think there's a big economic case for it at the moment? And do you think that as a trend, there'll be an increasing case for cities and developments to become more sustainable?
Yeah. I think on the sustainability front, what I think is going to change is that in the past, we've only been focused really on environmental sustainability. And I would say as an economist, environmental sustainability is a much easier challenge to tackle than economic and social sustainability. Because at least you can have a technological or, a technological solution to environmental sustainability. Whereas things such as social and economic sustainability require more than just applying a technology solution to it. Would that increase in the future in terms of our expectations? Absolutely. I think the expectations on sustainability would be broader beyond environment. Secondly, I think it's the same driver as expectations on placemaking, is that people are becoming a lot more concerned and willing to pay more, actually, if products, for instance, have been produced in an environmentally sustainable way, or if they have been produced in a way that assists certain less fortunate segments of society. So certainly I think that's something that is going to increase in the future.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time, Princess. And if people want to find out more about Urbis or follow you in any places on the internet, where can they find you?
You can check us out on our website, www.urbis.com.au. And it was my pleasure speaking to you as well.
Hey guys, Adam here. Just before you go, just one quick request. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review. It helps our rating and ranking on iTunes, so more people can hear from the people who are making our cities better places for our future.